Okay, in this presentation, we're going to spend some time looking at Post-Impressionism, coming on the heels of Impressionism, closing out the 19th century. This, for our purposes at least, will be a transition point between Impressionism and the modern era, which we'll be looking at in our weeks to come. So three guys we're going to spend time talking about today: Cezanne, Sirrah, and Van Gogh. Though we're going to do it in a little bit of a different order. So this is just a reminder of where we were, all right? This is Impressionism, Monet. A difference, of course, between Manet and Monet, which hopefully you recall. This is a piece by Monet. Impression Sunrise kind of gave name to that whole movement of Impressionism. You see in here this emphasis on color and on perspective. We talked about the difference between the realists and the impressionists. The realists looking to get an almost photographic kind of approach to the object itself, while the impressionists were interested in their own subjective experience of color and shape and shadow, creating something that could change depending on the environment that it was founded in. So while the realists were very interested in setting up things in the studio and creating these kinds of intentional modelings, the Impressionists, like Monet, would go to the same location time and time again and watch it at different times of the day and different hustles and bustles and colors and shadows and shadings, and find new opportunities of imbuing a standard place with a way of seeing. And that was the thing that was artistic, not the object itself, but the manner in which the artist was approaching the object. Post-Impressionism is going to pick up on that same idea, but it's going to try to pull Impressionism closer to structure and form and balance. And so the first person that we'll look at, Seurat, is very interested in this technique called pointillism, which maybe if you've taken art classes before, you've interacted with, where just by creating small dots, you try to create a full picture. This was a goal for him to create this kind of purity of color, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And it also creates this sense of like an optical illusion, because when you stand back from it, you're not aware that it's all created of these little dots. And when you zoom in closer, you see different details that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So these are the two pieces by him that we'll look at. And this is the first one, A Sunday Afternoon. So just a couple brief things to notice about this piece, right? Structurally, the subject itself seems very close to the Impressionists. The Impressionists were also interested in these kind of aristocratic French social visits where people would be strolling around and engaging in these kinds of pleasantries. You can sort of see this kind of dot formation depending on where you look in the painting, but as you zoom in a little bit closer, here details of this woman sitting here with her parasol and her daughter clutching these flowers. You see that every little mark and every little dab of paint is very intentionally placed to create this cumulative effect. Now, I mean, imagine creating a piece of art in general, hard. Then imagine doing it with this kind of very demanding and very minute detail. What you'll see here, if you were to examine this even closer, is that Seurat was not mixing colors. So instead of trying to mix two colors together to create purple, he would put a red and a blue dot very close together. And the idea that he had was that your mind would kind of play a trick on you. Your eye would see these two colors and your eye itself would do the blending. And his purpose for that was, if you mix purple, you're not really getting a true red. You're not really getting a true blue. You're inevitably creating something that's not like a true and pure color. Purple, of course, being a mix. And depending on how much you mix, you get these different values to the color. So his attempt in creating this was really for a respect of color and the assumption that the viewer would be able to see the color that he had intended without him having to tamper the color with that kind of mixture, right? Here's two images on the left and the right. On the left, you have something that is impressionistic, a painting by Renoir. And on the right here by Seurat, you have a painting that is post-impressionistic, right? So this is not, on the left-hand side, the kind of impressionism that's all just these dabs of color, but you do see plays with light, the dappling on the back of this man's suit jacket, the way that certain elements of the face are lit up and others aren't. You get the sense of things that are blurred in motion in the background, right? Something that has a particular aesthetic. This one on the right seems much more structurally sound, right? It's not as flowy. The individual characters don't bleed into each other. The light itself is kind of clearly coming from one direction, where it dances and plays as the people themselves dance and play in the Impressionism impressionistic piece. And what you're seeing here is, again, this attempt by the post-impressionists to kind of bring impressionism up to a different kind of level. Here's a piece that you can get a better sense of that kind of pointillism. Again, very much a impressionistic subject, but rendered in a bit of a different way, with the hope of creating some more shapeliness and some more structure than the Impressionists did. So perhaps no better artist was able to do that than Paul. Oh my goodness, than Paul Cezanne, another French artist. In his still lifes, and we'll spend some time talking about one of them in particular, we see that he's moving away from this idea of art as an accurate representation of nature. And if you'll remember our conversation from last week, we talked about Whistler being suing Ruskin for libel, right? Because he was accused of just putting dabs of paint on a canvas and asking people for money. And he said, look, my intent was never to say this is a realistic portrait of a bridge. He was saying, I'm creating art, and art is, of course, layered in with the individual reader, or in this case, viewer's perspective on the piece. And so Cezanne is also of that ilk, kind of reacting differently to this idea that a photograph can give you a realistic portrayal of a bridge or of a landscape. Cezanne, most known for his still lifes and his landscapes. If you want a good picture of a landscape, then go on Google Images to find a good picture of a landscape. Cezanne said, if you want art, then we're going to have this clearer idea of nature mixed with the artist's representation. And those two things coming together will create an aesthetic, will create a different approach to the thing that is. So remember Arts and Culture? Quick quote from Arts and Culture, that he wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable. These are Cezanne's words himself. So that he wanted to, again, take the kind of impressionistic approach to color and to light, and to bring some more solidity and something more solid to it. So Gombrich, who's a famous art scholar, author of the book The Story of Art, which I'll use throughout this presentation, considers him the father of modern art. And he says this about Cezanne: in his tremendous effort to achieve a sense of depth without sacrificing the brightness of colors, to achieve an orderly arrangement without sacrificing the sense of depth. In all the struggles and gropings, there was one thing he was prepared to sacrifice if need be: the conventional correctness of outline. So looking at his pieces is probably the best way to understand this. Here's what Cezanne said about his own art. He said, treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, the cone. Now, this will probably remind you of what Monet said, right? Monet also said, don't look at the object, look at colors, look at light, and look at shadow, right? Cezanne brings us something, though, that has more structure. It's not as ambiguous as light or shadow. It has shapeliness to it, right? It's geometric in its outline. And this, of course, which we'll see a lot when we get to Picasso and Cubism and other kinds of abstract and surrealist painters, we'll see a movement away from this kind of like impressionistic, atmospheric kind of ambiguity into something that has solidity, but is increasingly moving away from something that has meaning in the object itself. So abstract art and some of the cubist stuff we'll look at it'll just be cylinders and spheres and cones, and it won't be connected to some like grander meaning. And it starts here with Cezanne. Continuing, everything in proper perspective so that each side of an object or a plane is directed toward a central point. Lines parallel to the horizon give breadth. That's a section of nature. Lines perpendicular to this horizon give depth. But nature, for us men, is more depth than surface, whence the need of introducing into our light vibrations, represented by reds and yellows, a sufficient amount of blue to give the impression of air. All right, so here's what you get from Cezanne. You get an attempt to create depth and along the lines of nature as it readily appears, through the use of line and through the use of color. And so when you look at this painting, you'll see that he achieves depth through these kinds of lines, and these kinds of lines, and these kinds of lines, right? And through the differences in color, so that we get a deeper green up here, and we get lighter and paler colors in the back. And even though these are exactly the same size, right, we're aware just by the illusion that this man has created through his art, the way that he has shaped things and structured things, that we're looking at something that feels three-dimensional, even though, of course, It's very two-dimensional, and even as you look at it, somewhat obviously so. He's not doing some of the classical and older things that other masters did to create depth in their pieces. There's no chiaroscuro here. There's no tenebrism here. It feels very deep, even though at the same time it's very flat. That mountain in the back, which should be so strong and angular, is very pillowy and soft. It looks like folded laundry, and the impression that Cezanne is able to create here is a new aesthetic. Some of the art critics I've been looking at to help create this presentation said that Cezanne attempted to paint as if no one had ever painted before. He wanted to not do something revolutionary. It wasn't reactionary. It was just fresh. He just wanted to look at it fresh, as though those tools were not available to him, as though there weren't other masters to copy or to imitate. And so, like Monet, Cezanne found himself painting the same mountain and the same landscapes in multiple times and multiple seasons to try to create a sense of the value of artistic expression over the value of the object itself. And that probably is nowhere clearer than in this still life. If you're looking at the still life, you probably notice a couple things are a wee bit wonky. Maybe most notably this bowl that is obviously not centered on this pedestal, right? It seems like that should be like here, not over here, right? You look at this glass and it also feels like it's leaning maybe more than it should. If you think about leaning, look at this table. It looks like it's both leaning this way and also like it's tilted backwards, which doesn't seem to be a good representation of a still life. If you were to look at older still life, here, Kauf's still life with the drinking horn from 1653, so that's 17th century, that's right around like the Renaissance meeting the Baroque period. You have something that looks way better. Cezanne's on the right looks like something you would see at like a middle school art fair. It doesn't look like something that has like a ton of depth and meaning to it. What Cezanne is doing, though, is suggesting very different purposes for why he's interested in art. He's not trying to create a realistic impression of what's there. He's more interested in color. He's more interested in these different values and tones. He's interested in balance, which is why he elongates this piece to fill this portion of the canvas rather than the bowl ending probably where it should, which is about here. Oops, sorry. He's interested in these deep colors, being able to create these rounded objects in this way, even though this apple looks smushed and the napkin itself almost looks like it could be tinfoil, right? This kind of abstraction of the object, where again, the goal is not accurate representation, but is this kind of like movement around the object, is at the core of what's coming. That's definitely what we'll see when we look at surrealist paintings like Dali, and then as well when we look at modernist paintings from Picasso to Jackson Pollock. These things will be, again, much less interested in realistic portrayals of nature.